Okay, so a while back, which was indeed a while back, I made a video about my editing process, and since then I've received some comments where you were asking for a commentary because the process itself wasn't self-explanatory. So here we are. This is the voiceover version on your demand. I rarely shoot with a camera on location, and I'm mostly editing video game photography, ranging from scenery to portrait shots and everything in between. The method I'm using does work universally, however it translates the best on portraits, which is why I choose this specific photo. Please note that this is not going to be an in-depth tutorial, more like a general guide that you may learn from. The first thing I usually do when I start things off, I figure out what I would like the shot to be. For this image I've decided to go for a soft painterly look, so I selected one of these mostly self-made presets which worked the best. Then I moved on to the details tab to fine-tune the blur on the skin. I personally like her acne scars because they make her unique, hence I opted for a less blurry look. And I won't be touching up those any further than that what you see here. By pressing Y on the keyboard and zooming in, you can compare side by side what you started with and what you currently have, and have a look at the details if you choose. After that I did some basic adjustments to the image to further soften the look, but not the skin, and giving that glowy bloom-like effect to it. As you can see, I didn't raise the exposure, instead I adjusted everything else, including lowering the contrast to reduce the harshness. This helps with achieving my goal, but also washes out the photo. I brought back some of the contrast with the texture slider. It works much better in this case because it doesn't mess with the saturation and the black and white levels, unlike clarity. By lowering clarity, you can create an artificial bloom effect and lower the whites. The vibrance was lowered to bring the color's hue closer together, and the saturation is boosted to add some color back to the washed out photo. Next up, I will be framing the subject with the graduated filter. This time I will be lowering the exposure and raising the black levels, and do the opposite in the angle where the light is bouncing off the skin. There's already a pretty significant change in how the light works, and we will be pushing it further. However, there are a couple of fine-tuning steps that still remain. I used 4 gradients in this image to get the look I wanted, and changed the temperature now that the photo has this general shape. I wanted her eyes to be the focus, so I went with a trick I liberally like to use. I opened the brush tool and painted her pupils on both sides. What I want is to have a larger contrast between the dark and the light parts, and to have more detail without having to use any extra textures. I played around with the sliders again and created something that popped more. Zooming out and checking how the adjustments translate in full view is key during this step, otherwise it can come off really badly executed. Because I knew I could do with some more brightening, I added some points on the tone curve and tweaked the highlights mostly. To finish up the work in Lightroom, I went for the color sliders to tame the overly warm tones and to add some split toning. For the highlights, I added a touch of yellow to mimic an old painting's look, and for the shadows I picked the blue tone to keep the colors on the cool side. And for the last step, I adjusted decalibrations, which is a great tool for you to use if you want to get a specific filmic look. After some back and forth between the color sliders, my work in Lightroom was done and I could move on to Photoshop. And now for the actual fun part, which will probably be the most useful for those who want to learn how to manipulate light without using gradients. You don't need any pressure sensitive equipment for these steps. All you need is a mouse or a touchpad, it's up to you which one. And for the true horror for many, we will be working on one layer. We will be faking lights, both highlights and shadows, and creating depth with the dodge and burn tools. It's a fairly simple business. You burn where the shadows are and dodge where the lights are. If you're working on a portrait such as this, you could work as if you were applying makeup and do contouring. For example, you will see me darkening the sides of the nose and the bottom of the lips, the hollows of the cheeks, and the sides of the temple. On the other hand, I'm highlighting the entire midsection of the face, the under eye section, the inner corner of the eyes, under the top of the brow bone, down the bridge and the tip of the nose, the top of the lip, and the mid portion of the chin. TLDR, it's a game of patience and looking out for details. This technique also works on landscapes and on parts of the environment. See how I darken the edges of the frame to add some shadows to the back and draw more attention to her. I'm paying very close attention to the eyes as mentioned before. I'm enhancing what I already started in Lightroom, brightening the middle and darkening the edges of the pupils. I have the luxury of not having to worry about it looking too fake because the whole image has this ethereal glow around it. Of course, you don't have to go this heavy-handed, that's just the direction I went with. I focus on smaller and larger sections, adjusting the brush size almost constantly and zooming in and out to assess where I'm at. I'm not using anything fancy, just a regular round brush with feathery edges. The hardness is set to a really low amount, it's around at 10% at all times. You'll see me going back and forth between the two tools to counteract over lightening or over darkening the photo, as well as changing the range of how it applies. Burning the shadows adds a warm tone to the image, while burning the mid-tones will add a grayish tone to it and helps with evening out the overly bright parts. For the dodge tool, I stick with the midtones. It did the job well enough. There was no need to, for example, whiten the highlights. Normally this is where I would stop and pause the finished shot. However, given that this is a sort of tutorial, I thought I might go the extra mile and add some enhancements. I created a new layer, grabbed the same regular round brush and created a semicircle where the highlights in the eyes were. I do that on both sides, then grab the smudge tool and mimic the shape of the highlight by pushing and pulling on the white curve. I keep the white portion dense on the bottom and gradually fading it out towards the top. Then I move it into place using the move tool and the arrow keys. This pure white color is a tad too harsh, so I decreased the opacity by about 50%. I made two versions on separate layers, selected the one that looked better and deleted the other. Then to finish things off, I faked catch lights in the eyes. On the top right corner of the original image there was one light I could use to fake the rest. I used the stamp tool to sample the existing light and stamped it on the same area on the other eye, and ended up adding two more to fill up the empty space. This takes some fine-tuning and adjustments to make it work, but the general rule is to follow where the light is hitting the subject and place the catch lights there. Alternatively, you don't have to have a light to sample. A small round brush can be used to do the same. And that's about it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave it below. I'll try my best to answer them all as soon as I'm able. Thank you kindly for watching, and I hope you will have a lovely day.